Meantime, stocks are hitting some new all-time highs, obviously, as China says it has agreed with the U.S. to roll back tariffs. Despite the optimism, our next guest is sounding the China alarm. Joining us exclusively, Florida Senator Marco Rubio, who's leading a bipartisan effort to ban federal pension funds from investing in China. Senator, welcome back. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
First on the headlines, MOFCOM says we've agreed to this removal of tariffs in phases. Do we believe them?
Well, I think always with the Chinese, it's a question of compliance. And oftentimes we've seen them come to the edge of an agreement and then sort of try to redefine it. So obviously they don't have the most transparent process by which they make decisions and make announcements. But I just want to correct something on China. Look, I think China is and will continue to be an important, powerful country, that the other global power that the U.S. is going to be, but we have to be balanced. That's my concern. If there is not geopolitical, economic symmetry and balance between two great powers, it leads to great conflict. We've already seen that in the economic front, and we'll see that in the military front one day. And so my goal is to reorient U.S. policy towards more balance, which right now we're heading in a direction that puts us out of balance. And part of that is these investment decisions being made with federal retirement funds, the funds of federal employees, including servicemen and women.
You call this common good capitalism. Where does MSCI and funds, where do they fit in that?
Well, I mean, there's two separate topics there, but I think they're interrelated in the following sense, and that is I believe in free enterprise. I believe in the free market. I think socialism is a disaster. It hasn't worked anywhere it's been tried, and many of the ideas that are being put out there by Senator Warren and others are ideas, for example, like wealth taxes that have been adopted and abandoned by countries in Europe and other places. But the flip side of it, though, is that every market, even a free one, responds to conditions placed upon it by government policy. And my argument is that to the extent we place conditions on the market, they should be conditions that serve the common good. For example, protect our national interests. There might be industries where a pure market return may not justify it, but the U.S. needs to retain that capability. Or decisions about where to invest. In the case of federal employees, imagine the leverage the Chinese have of a significant amount of the retirement of servicemen and women in uniform and federal employees is invested in companies listed on Chinese exchanges that are not transparent, that do not undergo the same accounting scrutiny that companies elsewhere do. And by the way, many of these companies that are being capitalized by U.S. federal employee funds are active agents of the Chinese government in the intelligence realm and human rights violations and espionage and all sorts of activities, including stealing intellectual property and the like.
Senator Rubio, with that logic, we've got Aramco, Saudi Aramco's IPO coming down the pike next month. Would you extend that same kind of concern to investing in Saudi Arabian companies in the future?
I mean, potentially, if it would harm U.S. national interests. But I think it's very difficult to compare China to anyone, not because human rights violations aren't great no matter what. But Saudi Arabia does not seek to undermine the global order that's existed since the end of the Second World War and replace it with their own values at the expense of the ones that we and other nations have led. Saudi Arabia is not seeking to displace the United States as a great power. They're not seeking to dominate all of the key industries of the 21st century. We face in China the first near-peer competitor we've had since the end of the Cold War. Saudi Arabia is a country that we have an alliance with militarily and geopolitically that I have great concerns about when it comes to human rights and freedoms and other activities, but it is not at the same level from a geopolitical and pragmatic perspective.
But Senator, when I hear your proposals and many others, and obviously many who believe that China has been unfair in so many of its trade practices, are we headed towards a world in which there are going to be, as you said, two significant economic powers with their own orbits, and all the inefficiencies that perhaps will come as a result of that, all the added costs that will come as a result of that as well, potentially to be borne by Americans as well as others around the world?
Yeah, look, ultimately, you would prefer to have a world that's headed in the direction everybody thought it would head for a long time once China became rich and prosperous. But that really isn't the choice before us. The choice before us is potentially whether we want a world in which there are two different orders and orbits, one that reflects the values of freedom, the values of free trade and fair trade, or one that's dominated by China. There will only be one. What they want is only one global order, one global orbit, and it all to their benefit and looks like them. And that is not an appropriate outcome, and it certainly isn't good for this country or the world, in my view.
It does seem, though, that every time we have this conversation with you, things like farm subsidies come up in reaction to the trade war. Now it's about the flow of funds. People argue that our own standing as champions of free markets gets eroded a little bit with each incremental move. What do you make of that?
Well, I think you can make that argument when it comes to other countries. If it was up to me, we would not have been involved in multiple trade conflicts at the same time. For example, I have complaints about some of the practices that we see in Europe and some other countries. But like I just said about Saudi Arabia, these are not countries that are seeking to displace us and, in fact, are allies in many other matters. When it comes to China, we don't have fair trade with China. We don't have free trade with China. Their companies are protected in their domestic market. Their companies are allowed to do whatever they want here. So they benefit from free trade and from in one direction, but they don't allow it in the other. And how can that continue? At a very basic level, we should reach a point now where to say China is now a rich and powerful country, soon to be the largest economy in the world. Why are they able to do things here that our companies, our firms, are not able to do there?
Senator, I'm curious how your thinking has evolved over the last couple of years on this. We've had any number of people from both the right and the left, since we've been talking about China for the last 2 years, say TPP would have been a very effective way to marginalize the Chinese and really make the playing field more fair. I know at one point you seemed to support TPP. I'm curious as to where you stand now on something along the lines of that proposed partnership, which obviously is no longer going to happen.
Yeah, look, I thought it would have been a great counter to what China is trying to do in the Asia-Pacific region and the world writ large. Unfortunately, in 2016, as it turned out, both of the candidates, the Democratic candidate, the Republican candidate, President Trump, were both against it. So TPP was dead either way, since both of the people nominated were against it, and that's who the people voted for. But do I believe that at some point it's something we should revisit? Look, I think, frankly, the administration is, in my view, probably open to it. Rather than the one big deal, they're trying to do a bunch of bilateral deals with countries individual. I think it's harder to do it that way, but ultimately offering an alternative to what China is doing is certainly better. But right now, that's not in the cards, given the Trump view towards it, and frankly, Secretary Clinton's view when she was a candidate as well.
Senator, we always appreciate you spending some time with our viewers. Appreciate it very much. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Marco Rubio.